Hello, and thank you for joining us. My name is Matt Abbott, and I am the Director of Government and Diplomatic Programs at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. Thank you all for joining us via Zoom for today's on-the-record discussion on sports diplomacy. I would like to extend a special thank you to the Consulate General of Japan in Chicago for their generous support of a program series on sports diplomacy this year that is making this timely conversation possible. We hope you will join us on February 18th, March 3rd, and March 16th for additional conversations. Before we start this conversation, please note that the Council is a nonprofit, independent, and nonpartisan platform. The views expressed by individuals we host are their own and do not represent institutional positions or views of the Council. It is now my pleasure to introduce today's guests. Shihoko Goto is Deputy Director for Geoeconomics and Senior Associate for Northeast Asia in the Asia Program at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. And Jonathan Grix is a professor at Manchester Metropolitan University. Welcome, and thank you all for joining us. Before we get started, I first want to turn to Consul General Kenichi Okada for some brief remarks. Consul General Okada is the Consul General of Japan in Chicago, and thank you again for the Consulate's generous support of this series. Consul General.
Good morning, everyone. This is Kenichi Okada, the Consul General of Japan in Chicago. Thank you for joining us today for the Chicago Council on Global Affairs Digital Symposium on Sports Diplomacy, sponsored by the Consulate General of Japan in Chicago. I hope you are staying safe and staying healthy, and that we can get together in person in the near future. I'd like to take a moment to recognize and thank the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. It's always a great pleasure for our consulate to collaborate with CCGA. I'm so grateful to Mr. Matthew Abbott and other staff at the CCGA for their continued work in promoting greater knowledge of international events and issues. During the days of this symposium, we will hear from so many wonderful speakers, panelists, and moderators. I deeply appreciated today Ms. Shihoko Goto from the Wilson Center in Washington, D.C., and Dr. Jonathan Grix from the Manchester Metropolitan University in the United Kingdom will share their insights on sports diplomacy. Sports are a great way to understand another culture. So I have been very much delighted to see so many American friends in the Midwest who do Japanese sports like kendo or judo. Next month, in this symposium, an old Japan judo champion, Miss Megumi Ishikawa, will present her video about how she has shared her passion to judo with children in the Midwest. She has recently retired from Japan's national team of judo, and surprisingly she decided to live in Chicago to share the joy of judo with children in the Midwest and across the United States. So I'm really looking forward to her video, which she will present to this symposium next month. As a Consul General of Japan and as a Japanese national, I'm really looking forward to Tokyo Olympic and Paralympic Games. These two games were postponed due to the pandemic, like many international sports events in many countries. Since then, Japanese government has been working so hard to host these two games in Japan this year. So I truly hope that these two games will be held in Japan this year in a safe and secure manner for all of those involved, and it will become a wonderful testament to human spirit as well as the victory over the pandemic, to see many athletes around the world gather again. In the lead up to the Tokyo Olympic and Paralympic Games, the government of Japan launched Sports for Tomorrow project. Our goal is to promote the Olympic and Paralympic movement to people all around the world, especially young people who represent the future. Our project was launched in Asia, Africa, and South America, and aiming to improve their sports facilities and equipments, dispatch athletes and instructors to teach and offer technical cooperation in the sports-related fields. Our original goal was to contribute to sports programs reaching 10 million people in 100 countries by the end of 2020. Actually, we completed this target by September 2019, so it was a huge success. I believe sports will continue to be an important part of Japan's global outreach. Today's and over the course of this symposium, we will hear and learn a lot of new insights on the key role that sports will play in the international affairs. I'm looking forward to a very successful discussions with so many wonderful speakers, panelists, and moderators. Thank you so much to everyone involved to make this event possible. And once again, thank you so much.
Great. Thank you very much, Consul General. Professor Grix, I'd like to start with you with our first question. How would you define sports diplomacy, and what are the origins of sports diplomacy?
Oh, you should never ask an academic that, really, Matthew, because we'd be all day. But I'm going to give you a very short answer. Would be, I suppose, any attempt to use sport as a vehicle to achieve diplomatic ends would be a very, very short definition. But then you'd have to get into, who is using it, what type of sport, which level, and then those are things I guess will come out in our discussion. But there's, is it elite sport? Is it a sporting event? There's so many different types of sport diplomacy that a single definition is very difficult to give.
What are the origins of sports diplomacy?
Well, I guess you could go back 2,000 years because there was, of course, there was the famous Olympic truce in ancient Greece, which would be the very origins of it, I guess. But more up to date would be, and the most salient example would be throughout the Cold War and the use of sport there. In particular, from a state like East Germany or the German Democratic Republic, used sport, performance sport, elite sport, as a means through which to try to have their country recognised, because it was obviously it was an unrecognised state. So I guess that would be the sort of more recent origins of sports diplomacy.
Great, thank you very much. Ms. Goto, turning to you, what has been Japan's experience with sports diplomacy, and in what ways has sports diplomacy affected Japanese soft power?
So if we're look at sports diplomacy as soft power, and how Japanese sports has impacted public opinion, and how that has actually enhanced Japan's bilateral as well as multilateral relations, I'd like to point out two things. One is that Japan actually has its own homegrown sports. As Consul General Okada said in his opening remarks, judo is a national sport, as is kendo, aikido. They're both all homegrown. The national sport, of course, is sumo. And there are a lot of people who actually become interested in Japan through these martial arts and sports that are originate from Japan. But what's interesting is that Japan is actually a net importer of sports from overseas, especially from the United States as well as the UK. And the most popular sport in Japan right now is baseball. And certainly baseball has helped enhance US-Japan relations. The history goes back to the late 19th century, and there's been extensive research by academics, including people like Sayuri Shimizu of Rice University, really going through the history of US-Japan relations and how baseball has helped them. But today, when we look at baseball, if you look at the Japanese news and you see the opening for the sports programs, They'll always start with baseball because it's the most popular, and it usually starts with how the Japanese major league players are doing. People like Otani Shohei, Yu Darvish are doing here in the United States, and that gets relayed to the Japanese domestic baseball scene. And that really cultivates this relationship, a very warm, friendly relationship between Japan and the United States. You have it in many other sports as well. Here in Washington, we see basketball really playing a big role. We see someone like Rui Hachimura generate a lot of excitement amongst the Japanese because he's been recruited to play with the Washington Wizards. And it's not just resonated with the Japanese community here in Washington, but it's also elevated America's understanding of Japanese sporting excellence and also identity of Japanese players as well, because Hachimura also happens to be a mixed race, half black Japanese as well. Let me leave it at that for now.
Thank you very much.
Matt,
yes,
could I just I could just add to that I know I'm not the expert on Japan, but I thought it was very interesting in the Rugby World Cup, recent Rugby World Cup. It was the first Asian state to host rugby, and it seemed to me to be, and this is Shihoko, I'm sure you can tell more about this, but it seems to me to be part of an attempt of Japan to be a little more outward looking, with getting so many, they had so many foreign nationals coming to their country, enjoying the games, and there was such a feel-good factor around them games like I've not seen before, because it's not a major games. I mean, Olympics and the FIFA World Cup, these are normal things that this sort of it generates that sort of atmosphere. But I thought that was one of the most successful Rugby World Cups I've seen. And my understanding is that Japan is looking to, a little less inward and a little more outward looking in strategy. And the next Olympics will play into that too.
Yeah, so if I can add to that, definitely. So the Japanese rugby team of 2019, of the 31 players, 16 were actually foreign born, including people who were born in South Africa, South Korea, Samoa. And it was actually captained by a New Zealand-born player, Michael Leach. And they were very successful. They actually made it to the quarterfinals. And it really united Japan in a way that was unprecedented. There was this really big rallying around this team from very disparate backgrounds, coming together, exemplifying this idea that there is strength through diversity. And it did spur a lot of discussion within Japan about strength through diversity. And it also led to a lot of discussion about what it is to be Japanese, the identity of Japanese, and also a bigger conversation about immigration policy in Japan in general. But from the outside, it also led to this realization of Japan that is not as monoethnic as either the Japanese see themselves or how Japan is portrayed overseas, so that there is this modernization of Japan and this really a seismic shift in the Japanese society's makeup.
Thank you very much. Professor Grix, now turning to you, can you give us some examples of times when sports diplomacy has been successfully used to reduce political tensions?
I guess the most famous one is the so-called ping-pong diplomacy of the early 1970s, whereby through sport, and in this case ping-pong, there was a thawing of relations between the US and China. And so sport was a vehicle through which it brought about a step change in relations. And a couple of things to note there, though, that are of interest. One of which is that there wasn't a hope in hell that the US would beat China because they were the world champions, probably still are in ping pong. And so it took something away, because sport, the thing about sport is its unpredictability, but that was quite predictable. But that helped in this case, because you don't really want had the US team thrashed China, that probably wouldn't have been good for the relations at the time. But this is an example of what I call an icebreaker. So, and that's what I meant at the outset, Matt, when I was saying there's very different types of sport diplomacy. So this is state-led, high-level, traditional diplomacy. And this is what we call an icebreaker. So it's something that without which you may not have got that step change that actually happened without this sporting event. So it really did play a crucial role. What its long-term impact was, I don't know. I mean, look at US-China relations now. It's still, we're back to where, perhaps where you were then. We need another sporting event. So I think that's the one that's wheeled out as the most sort of effective, those sort of ones. I guess the other one would be where the jury's still out is the recent South Korean Winter Games, where you had joint Korean teams. There was, for example, I think it was the hockey team. I think it was a women's hockey team was pulled from both North Korea and South Korea. So, and it was looked upon at the time, it looked as it could really impact on Korea relations. But I think, again, as with many of these things, at the time it was very useful because there was a heightened tension and it brought those tensions down. But long term, we have to look, what's the impact now? I mean, we're still, what's happened.
Thank you very much. Ms. Goto, yes, please.
I'm sorry. I just wanted to add to that. You asked about, how tensions can be abated or diffused through sports diplomacy. One of the things that Japan has actually been very good about is less about diffusing tensions, but actually enhancing that feel-good factor, that adding this another facet to diplomatic relations to promote its own brand, not just of sports, but of governance, and to promote its own values at a grassroots level. And I'm thinking specifically, for instance, in 2014, when then Prime Minister Shinzo Abe became the first Japanese prime minister in 8 years to visit Africa. And he met with the leaders of Ethiopia, Cote d'Ivoire, Mozambique, and he met with the leaders there. They discussed official development assistance, opportunities for technical assistance, and the usual traditional diplomatic conversations that one head of state would have with another. But Abe also met with the children of the Abebe Bikila, who is the Ethiopian marathon runner who won the 1964 Tokyo Olympic Games. And that really created this opportunity to have this real connection, and for Abe to have a charm offensive at home. He was able to connect the Japanese audience to the Ethiopian athlete, and through that to Ethiopia, and to a larger extent to Africa at large, and the effectiveness of aid and having good relationships with countries on the continent. But it was also an opportunity to really promote Japan's identity and values on the continent as well. Of course, Japan is a big manufacturer of sporting goods, everything from Asics to Yonex rackets to Mizuno apparel. And I want to give you an example. In Rwanda, I was there a couple of years ago, and Rwanda and Japan have a very good working relationship. There's this big level of trust between the two governments. But the Japanese embassy at Rwanda supported the Rwanda Triathlon in 2019, and they provided shoes and goggles and swimwear and all of these things. And so in the minds of a lot of Rwandans that I spoke to, they have been equating Japan not just with aid, effective infrastructure development projects, but also with this kind of common ground, this common appreciation of sports, and this idea that they share about fair play, having building teams, having trust. And these are really important values. And, if I put my IR hat on, it really does kind of, it's a very tangible example of how values are important in diplomatic relations and how Japan is different, for instance, from China and the Chinese value system as well.
Thank you very much. And on that note, a question for both of you. How will politics and sports diplomacy play into the upcoming both Summer and Winter Olympics?
Yeah, that's interesting because it's you've got both upcoming games are, of course, in East Asia. And you do have, when you think about these, when we think about, especially the concept of soft power, it's not just global, but it's also plays out in a regional area. And then you've got very recent games, large games have been held all in East Asia. So there's talk of a sort of East Asian ascendancy in the hosting of these events. And we've seen that. And you need to ask yourself why. And I've got one of my students who just passed his PhD this morning on this very topic. How these great states have been competing for these games for competing influence within the area, so in the region. So I think hosting these things, hosting these major events, become part of a strategic sort of geopolitical politics. It's not just about the fluffiness of sport. They do know that sport and their values are universal and they're global, and that's why we get billions of viewers. And so you're showcasing your nation there, and that was what I was alluding to earlier with Japan. I think they are ready. My sense is that they are ready for the world media to come and look. Under maybe not under these circumstances. We would prefer it otherwise without a pandemic, and no delay. But it's really about showcasing your nation globally, but also within that regional sphere. China, where if you go back to, you have to look at the politics behind it. You have to look at who actually attempted to host this event, and I think at the end it was between China and Azerbaijan. Nobody wanted the event. I mean, we do have to. They have become very, very expensive, some of these games, and I believe for China, for the Winter Olympics, they're actually going to have to produce fake snow. It's not fake news, but fake snow, which gives you an indication to lengths that people are going to go to host these things. If they haven't actually got enough snow, it must mean something for them that's over and beyond just the joy of sporting, watching sport. It has a lot of different variety of meanings.
Thank you. And Ms. Goto, do you have any comments on it?
Yeah, so even before the pandemic, climate change had actually made hosting the Winter Olympics in particular incredibly challenging. But just to go back to this idea of Japan hosting the upcoming Summer Olympics, of course, it had been slated to occur last summer, and it's been postponed for this year. And for now, the expectation is that it will move forward as planned, at least schedule-wise. There have been a number of very interesting polls done by the Japanese media. One of the most recent one is by the Japanese daily Yomiuri Shimbun, which found last week that 61% of those polled either wanted to cancel the Olympics outright or postpone it, whereas 36% said that they either want to have it with or without spectators. So the majority actually want to cancel or postpone. But there's this disconnect. For policymakers, it's not simply a major sporting event. This is a demonstration of geopolitical strength. And certainly this should have been the crowning glory for Japan's previous Prime Minister Shinzo Abe before his concluding glory to end his term as Japan's longest-serving Prime Minister. But of course, he had resigned before reaching that milestone last August. There is a lot of pressure on Japan to deliver. especially given the fact that China is going to be hosting these Winter Olympics. And I think we can probably safely assume that COVID will no longer be an issue by 2022. Tokyo would very much want to beat China in hosting the first games that could demonstrate to the world that the world has come together under incredibly difficult circumstances to recover from a pandemic. It would actually be able to showcase not just the usual infrastructure, technology, and its hospitality, but also its ability to keep a pandemic at bay. So there is a great deal of political impetus for Japan to actually pull this through.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. What role does sports diplomacy play at the subnational government level, especially as we talk about the costs of these events? Are any city governments particularly successful in leveraging sports diplomacy?
Shall I start with that one? I think sports diplomacy. I think less sports diplomacy, Matt, here, but more in terms of soft power. And what I think you're seeing is a tendency to away from hosting these massive events and more towards smaller localized events that are gaining more traction and more backing from the local population, because they're not costing the taxpayer so much. I'll give you one example. We host in the UK, we host in Yorkshire, it's a county in Yorkshire, in England and North. They host the first leg, or they've hosted the first leg of the Tour de France. And they like that because you don't need they use existing roads. So they don't need an arena. They build sort of temporary tents and things, for spectators. They get a lot of inbound tourism. So they get people from overseas, which is part of diplomacy, of course. You get a lot of people, a lot of visitors, but it's primarily an economic argument. They make a lot without spending a lot. So the expenditure is much, much lower, and you don't have the issues usually associated with hosting a major mega event, which range from economics for the first thing, that could cost so much, but they also you are bound by certain rules and regulations that are set by, say, FIFA or the IOC. So a big event is not just, it's going to cost you upwards of $10 billion, but it's also, you do have to, you end up changing employment law and other laws on the way. So this is that sub-level, the one you're alluding to, they're much easier, they're lower cost, and they can be highly effective for certainly on economics. And that, I'm not so sure about the diplomacy angle, however.
Thank you. And Ms. Goto, any comments on that?
Yeah, so the economic decisions to hold the Olympics has really evolved over the decades. In the case of Japan, in the 1960s, it was really a platform to Japan to say that it had recovered successfully from the rubbles of World War II. It was an impetus to build infrastructure, including building up the Shinkansen, the bullet trains network. And it also spurred domestic consumption of television sets and the like. That kind, as the country goes up in economic ladder, that kind of national economic stimulus factor of hosting an Olympic Games actually declines. But as you said, there can be more effectiveness at the local level done strategically. But of course, this involves a lot of politics as well. If done right and partnered well with the private sector, it can be done, but it's still a very tricky equation to navigate.
Absolutely. And turning to our final question, we've alluded to the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic on the Olympics from last year and going into this year. How has sports diplomacy more generally been affected by the pandemic, and how do you anticipate sports diplomacy moving forward after the pandemic may be affected?
Do you want me to start?
Yes, please.
Yeah. Yeah, sorry. I've just written something recently on this. At the beginning of the pandemic, I wrote a piece about sport with no audience. And, like, because we've got football, got soccer here, where there's really no one in the stadium, so there's no atmosphere. And if you think of these big events, and in terms of our topic today in public diplomacy, what you're attempting to do in part is not only showcase the nation, but by getting in those thousands and thousands of people from overseas coming to visit your country, that is in effect on each and every one of them. It's a mini diplomatic action, because they tend to go back and say, I've had a fantastic time. You see it in one of the best examples was Germany in 2006. So Germany was plagued for many years. That's not the Olympics, that's the World Cup, of course, FIFA World Cup. But same principle is that what they did then, you wouldn't be able to do now. That's my point. So COVID has prevented this. What they did in 2006 was done something that most states are not able to do, is alter the perception of their state. So if you have a perception, a stereotypical perception of Germany was first and foremost Nazism. It lived with this past many 50 years after. The British press kept writing about this. So right up until 2006. Then what they're attempting to do through these games is present Germany in a totally different light. So it's either Nazism references, or it's boring, Germany's efficient, and then they're not fun-loving, But these games, and they were able to do this with these games, were to actually alter their image. And it's been one of the reasons why people have wanted to host these mega events. It's spurred, if you like, it's boosted the number of people wanting to host these. And thereafter, you see it in South Africa, you see it in other countries that have something they want altered in the perception of their country. They're using this event to do that. Now, the way you do that is by having people there, they meet you, the cultural inter-exchange. And this is something you're not going to have if you have a games, and getting back to your question, Matt, long way around, but it's important, because you imagine a games where no one's coming there, or you're very limited. You've only got half a dozen people watching it. They can watch it from home, but it's not the same. You've lost that feel-good factor. You've lost that, what we call collective effervescence, that sort of buzz. People go, and when they see sport, there's a buzz. And it's that buzz that helps you transcend lots of the, stereotypes that people have. And that's how, that's what happened in Germany. And that's won't happen if you haven't got a crowd. So that would be my answer to that question of if sport continues without having that sort of interaction, and it's all going to be like this, it'll all be intangible, then I think you'll lose something.
Thank you very much.
Unfortunately.
And Ms. Goto, please.
So, of course, whether or not the Olympics can be held safely is going to be Japan's biggest challenge. If it does it right, if it is able to pull this off, it really does change the image of Japan tremendously. It portrays this image of Japan that is global, responsible, provides healthcare, provides the kind of safe network that the world is craving. But at the same time, if we look at Japan as a society and the perceptions a lot of people have, and a lot of them are actually right, is that Japan is, the economy has fallen behind that of China. It's dealing with an aging population. What it wants to do is to say that it is very technologically advanced. It is an incredibly attractive place for good talent, globally competitive talent to be drawn to Japan. So this opportunity to host the Olympics would actually give that leverage to Japan. It wants to attract innovators, risk takers. If it is positioning itself as an innovator and risk taker in hosting the Olympic Games, it can actually create a very healthy competitive cycle that would actually reflect well on it as well.
Thank you very much. Ms. Goto, Professor Griggs, thank you for sharing your expertise on our platform this morning. I'd also like to once again thank the Consulate General of Japan in Chicago and Consul General Okada and his wonderful team for their generous support of this series. We look forward to you tuning in to future events, and once again to our panelists, thank you very much.